time today. All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Navigate, the family-focused series that aims to address issues around life, relationships, and parenting. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome Nicole Gordon, the CEO of JNETICS, together with Aviva Lewis, the Research, Development, and Outreach Manager, to present this evening. JNETICS is a registered charity dedicated to improving the prevention and management of Jewish genetic disorders in the UK. They focus on genetic conditions that, although not exclusively Jewish, are of particular relevance to people of Jewish ancestry. Probably most known Tay-Sachs, as well as raising awareness for Jewish genetic disorders, JNETICS provides carrier screening for some of the most severe Jewish genetic disorders. The organization also makes sure to signpost to the very best services, support, and information resources. And without further ado, I shall hand over to Nicole Gordon, the CEO of JNETICS, and to Aviva, the Head of Research and Development. Please note that we'll have some time for questions near the end, so please do hold them, note them down, and you can either use the chat function or unmute yourself at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, and what a lovely introduction. I think you've done half the presentation for us, so that's fantastic. Thank you. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to what all parents need to know about Jewish genetic disorders. As Shoshana said, my name is Nicole Gordon, and I'm the CEO of JNETICS. And presenting along with me tonight is the lovely Aviva Lewis, who is our Outreach, Research and Development Manager. You may or may not have heard about JNETICS. You may or may not have heard about JNETICS from your children being screened through schools. But probably the best way to introduce the charity is just to show you a short film, which I hope will sum up the importance of the wonderful work that we do.
Our son Benjamin was born in 1978. He was diagnosed at 5 days old with cystic fibrosis. He had to have at least 1 or 2 hours physiotherapy every day and lots of very unpleasant treatment. Despite that, he actually had a good life. He loved sport. He ended up at Cambridge studying medicine, qualified as a doctor. At 23, he married his childhood sweetheart and was married for 3 years. On the 2nd of October 2005, at the age of 26 and a half, he died very suddenly from the effects of cystic fibrosis.
Our friends had gotten tested during their pregnancy. They had discovered that they were both carriers of a Jewish genetic disorder. We heard about a screening in our synagogue. Richard went to that screening. We got a letter through the post to say Richard was a carrier of Tay-Sachs when Leah was about 12 weeks old. I went straight to Guy's Hospital and I got tested as well, being told I was also a carrier. They said to us, bring Leah down and get her tested as an absolute emergency. And then we somehow left the hospital and got back home, and we basically sat there. It was just the worst 48 hours of our lives.
We agreed that we would come in on Wednesday afternoon.
Somehow we got ourselves to Guy's Hospital. We walked in the door, we could tell straight away that it was all fine. Our lives restarted again.
Us both knowing that we're carriers isn't going to stop us having further children, but it just means we can now take the steps that we need to take. And if Leah had Tay-Sachs, it's not a question of she could have a life and continue her life. She would have died.
The Genius program is designed to ensure that, so far as possible, the most common life-threatening Jewish genetic disorders disappear from the UK community.
We didn't know about screening until it was, if you like, too late.
Without the programme, people will be completely unaware of these, and it's empowering the person to allow them to make their own decisions. It means they have the knowledge.
And why on earth would anybody want to take a risk? Why does anybody want to bring up a child that is very unwell, that suffers and may die at a very young age?
I don't think any parent should have to go through what me and Lauren have gone through, and this is a way to prevent it.
If people realised the devastating consequences of having a child with one of these disorders, they would not think twice about taking the necessary precautions.
Okay, so after watching the film, I'd just like to sort of give you a little bit of the background to JNETICS. JNETICS as a charity was actually established over 10 years ago, back in 2010. And to date remains the only cross-communal charity devoted to the prevention and management of Jewish genetic disorders. And what is a Jewish genetic disorder? Well, quite simply, and Shoshana touched on it and the film touched on it as well, but it's basically a genetic disorder that is more prevalent in the Jewish community than the general population. Back in 2010, JNETICS was actually set up as an education-based charity, dedicating itself to being a community resource for genetic disorders. But 4 years later, we started physically screening for the disorders. And to date, I'm proud to say that we've screened over 4,000 young adults. And I'll talk a little bit later about the programs that we actually screen through. Since screening has started, we have actually identified at least 4 carrier couples, and you saw Lauren and Richard in the film, and they were obviously a carrier couple, which means that they were both carrying the defective gene for the same condition. So we have definitely identified 4, probably more than 4, but we actually never get the results, and we rely on the individuals coming back to us and wanting to share their story so that other people can come forward and be screened. JNETICS as a charity currently screens for 9 of the most severe recessive Jewish genetic disorders. And you can see them to the right, and I'm sure you've heard of Tay-Sachs, and I'm sure you've heard of cystic fibrosis. But the other 7, unless sadly you have been affected or someone you know has been affected by one of these conditions, you probably aren't aware of them. So tonight, actually, there is some exciting news, because only yesterday, after 2.5 years of extremely hard work and research, which really has been pioneered by Aviva, we're actually increasing the panel of conditions that we screen for. And from September, we'll actually be screening individuals for 50 plus conditions. So we'll be moving, just under 50, I think it's 49. So we'll be moving from 9 conditions to 50, which is a significant advancement. We'll be screening for more conditions that are prevalent, very prevalent in the Ashkenazi community, but we will also be screening for conditions that are prevalent in the Sephardi community, which is a major breakthrough for us. We work really closely with the NHS. We're very unique in that sense. We work closely with a genetic counselling team at Northwick Park Hospital. Next slide. So what is our mission statement? As a charity, we exist to make a real difference to the prevention, diagnosis and management of Jewish genetic disorders by raising awareness and facilitating access to the best available information, services and support for those affected and at risk. In essence, we exist to save lives, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to prevent the heartache for young couples of having babies born into the community with one of the devastating genetic illnesses that we screen for. Where and how do we screen? One thing I probably should say is that since COVID, we actually have moved to a totally virtual screening. So pre-COVID, we had in situ screening, or in schools and universities, or couples or individuals 21 plus who were sort of closer to the age of going to have children actually went to the Barnet Clinic, which was part of Barnet Hospital. But last March, we had to think very quickly on our feet, and we pioneered through Oxford University a virtual screening, which worked fantastically well. And we actually took that forward. And our whole screening program for the last 18 months has been virtual, which means kits through the post, a virtual Zoom genetic counselling, sort of pre and post. And it's worked really well. And it's actually allowed us to screen more individuals at a quicker rate and across a greater geographical reach. So we have two programs at the moment. Our first program, which you may have heard of, is called the Genius program. And the Genius program screens through schools and universities. We screen kids in year 12. We educate and we screen. Obviously, at this age, the education is as important as the physical screening. We screen in all 9 Jewish schools across the country. One thing to say is that in COVID times, it has been extremely difficult. We haven't actually been able to get into schools, but we just presented to Yavna today. We did our first education since COVID hit us, and we'll actually be going back into the schools in the autumn term and recommencing the Genius screening program. So that's quite exciting. We also screen in universities. Pre-COVID, we were hitting 2 to 3 of the universities per year. But last November, once again, we had to think quick, and we ran a virtual, we called it the Genius University Screening Week, and we ran a whole week of virtual screening, and we managed to screen in that week alone 300 students. So that was hugely successful and is happening again this November. The Genius program in schools and universities is fully subsidised by JNETICS, and every test that we do costs us £300, and that's for the actual analysis of the test and the genetic counselling. So it comes at a considerable cost to this charity, and we receive no government funding. So we have to work really, really hard at fundraising and working with our major donors to make sure that we can bring in the money to continue to screen the parents. Our second avenue, which we touched on earlier, is the JNETICS clinic, which, as I said, is totally virtual, and it's basically there to try and capture the 21 to 39-year-olds that haven't been screened through schools and universities and are closer to the age of beginning to think about having children. This is partly subsidised by JNETICS, and the cost to the individual is £250. So we do pay towards it. So Jewish genetic disorders are more common in people of Jewish ancestry relative to the general population. They're not exclusive to the general population, to the Jewish population. And very often it can be a mutation that is more prevalent within the Jewish community. And that's actually the case with cystic fibrosis. They're associated with ancestry and not observance. And they're present in the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi and Mizrahi populations. At this point, I'm actually going to pass over to Aviva, who's going to take you through a little bit of the science behind Jewish genetic disorders.
Thanks, Nicole. So don't worry, it's not going to be too heavily scientific, but it's just more of the background information to help you understand this topic a bit better. So a lot of people wonder why these disorders exist at all in amongst Jewish people, and it's actually to do with something that's known as the founder effect. So let's say there's a given population, a large population, and due to some sort of external factor such as persecution or disease, the population is suddenly really restricted, leading to a small population. And then after that external factor alleviates, that the small population can then go on to, perpetuate and grow. So we expect that happened to the Jewish population, probably due to persecution, because we've been persecuted for quite a few times in history. But what can happen is that when the population restricts due to the external factor, certain genetic traits can become, just by chance, disproportionately represented in that smaller population. And when that small population then goes on to increase through reproduction, those genetic traits that are disproportionately represented, just grow and grow and grow within the new bigger population. So the new population after the genetic bottleneck, as it's called, has relatively more cases of that genetic trait compared to the original larger population. So that's basically what we think has happened to make these genetic disorders more common in the Jewish population rather than the general one. And this kind of this founder effect and this kind of phenomenon of there being genetic disorders that are more common in a certain ethnic group is not just specific to Jewish people. So all ethnic groups are usually associated with certain genetic disorders. So, for example, people with a Mediterranean origin are more likely to inherit something called thalassemia, which is a genetic blood disorder, or people with African origin are more at risk of something called sickle cell anemia. So it's not just Jewish people, but it's just, the same phenomenon can occur in different ethnic groups. So you saw the list of disorders on one of the early slides that we screened for. The most kind of famous or notorious Jewish genetic disorder that we cover is Tay-Sachs, and that's a condition like all the 9 that are covered in our screen that are that's inherited in a recessive manner, which basically means that for a child to inherit the condition, both parents need to be carriers for that condition. So they both need to carry the faulty gene associated with the disorder. And for a couple in that scenario, we call it a carrier couple, there's a 1 in 4 chance with every pregnancy that they will have an affected child. So Tay-Sachs is inherited in that manner. And we heard in the video that it's a really awful, fatal condition with onset at around 6 months. And actually screening for Tay-Sachs has been happening for quite a few decades within the UK, which has had an amazing impact because it means that Tay-Sachs, I think, virtually never occurs in the community at all anymore. And the same thing has happened internationally. International Jewish communities have basically managed to eradicate this disorder through routine screening. So in 1999, that's when the NHS actually took on Tay-Sachs carrier screening as their responsibility. And actually at the moment, if someone would be interested in just screening for Tay-Sachs, they could get it through the NHS simply by speaking to their GP, and they would get a referral to their local regional genetics centre. So Tay-Sachs is this one kind of most famous Jewish genetic disorder, but one of the messages we try to emphasize is that it's not just Tay-Sachs. It's amazing what we've managed to do in the UK with Tay-Sachs, but there are other conditions that people need to be aware of and be thinking about. So firstly, I want to bring to your attention 2 other kind of categories of Jewish genetic disorders, and then lastly we'll go on to the severe ones that we are screening for. But the first, in this first column, there's actually disorders that, rather than inherited in the same way as Tay-Sachs disease, which is recessive inheritance, there's 2 disorders that are inherited in a dominant way. So there's the BRCA-associated cancers, which are more prevalent in the Jewish population, and then there's DYT1 generalized dystonia, which also happens to be a dominant Jewish genetic disorder. So just to give a nod to BRCA, this is a condition that as a charity we focus on a lot, although it's not covered, and I'll stress that it's not covered in our carrier testing because it's dominant and because of what it means to be a carrier for that disorder. We can't and won't cover it in the same test as with the recessive conditions, but it's BRCA-associated cancers are something very significant for the community. A lot of people are affected, and we have a lot of information on our website and are always answering queries and helping people to access the right services that they're eligible for on the NHS. So those are the dominant Jewish genetic disorders. And then this middle category are recessive disorders, but they're mild and they're treatable. So if someone has them, they're not, their length of life isn't impacted, and that's why they're not on our carrier screening test, because we've chosen specifically disorders that if a child has them, they will inevitably have a shortened life, and they're not treatable or curable at all. But these are also disorders that people in our community may be affected by, and we do sometimes get questions about them. We have information about some of them on our website, and they're definitely of interest to us as a charity. But I guess the final category here are the ones that Tay-Sachs is the most famous of, but it's a whole group of disorders that are recessively inherited and extremely severe conditions that cause severe disability, shortened life. They're totally incurable, but the most important thing that we can feel positive about, despite them being such awful conditions, is that they are entirely preventable through carrier screening. So here's just another chart showing these conditions again. And you can read, if you can read fast, the short descriptions, but they're all basically severe conditions. Each of them have a different carrier rate within the community. So the kind of how common it is for someone with Ashkenazi ancestry to be a carrier. So the most common is Tay-Sachs disease. So the carrier rate is 1 in 25. And of the group, the least common is mucolipidosis with a carrier rate of around 1 in 100. But all of them are more common within the Jewish population compared to the general one. And actually, if you were to take this group as a whole and ask yourself how common is it for someone to be a carrier of any of these conditions, so one or more of them, international research and our screening program has basically confirmed the same statistic, which is basically that the risk for anyone with Ashkenazi ancestry for being a carrier for one of these conditions is 1 in 5. So that means it's extremely common for people to be carriers. Like 1 in 5, I'm not sure how many people are here or watching, but let's say there's 20 people on the Zoom and watching, 4 people are going to be carriers of these conditions, and for one of the conditions, and unless they've been screened, or unfortunately unless they've had an affected child, they wouldn't know about it. So I guess this statistic 1 in 5 could maybe worry people, but on the other hand, it really normalizes being a carrier. It's a very normal thing to be a carrier, and being a carrier doesn't mean you necessarily will have an affected child. It just means it's extremely beneficial to be aware of your status for when it comes to planning a family. So just to explain, because we've said we offer carrier screening is a way to prevent these conditions, but just to go into that in a bit more detail, as I said, 1 in 5 people are carriers, and essentially what it means to be a carrier is that if your partner is a carrier for the same disorder too, you are at a significant risk of having a child who's affected. So the positive thing about all this, and the reason why these conditions are preventable, is because carrier couples do have reproductive options that they can use to make sure that they actually do not have an affected child, and make sure to not pass on the disorder to their children. So there are options for carrier couples, but the first stage for even being able to access that is for the couple to know that they are a carrier couple first. If they don't know, they can't access the options, and every time they get pregnant, they're basically playing it's just an awful gamble, and 1 in 4 times they will have an affected child. So that is really why carrier screening is so important. It's basically the gatekeeper to those reproductive options for any carrier couples identified. And I've just included a diagram at the bottom there, which shows one of these options for carrier couples. So it's known as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So a couple who is a carrier couple, once identified, will then be supported by a genetic counsellor to decide how they want to go about having their family, and they can choose PGD as one of those options. So the couple will essentially go through the IVF process, but before the embryos are implanted back into the mother, they're genetically tested, and only the ones that are not going to be affected will be put back in. So it's an amazing technology for basically the couple to be confident that the pregnancy that results will not then end up with a child that's got the really severe condition that they both carry. So the screening process for someone that takes part in our screening, either through the Genius program or through the clinic, includes all the same essential elements. So the first part of it is for them to understand their chance of being a carrier and really be informed about what the test is. So they'll always be explained there's a 1 in 5 chance that they could be a carrier for one of these conditions. Next, someone will always be asked about if there's any family history in their own family of someone who's a carrier or affected by one of the conditions, because if there is a proven case in their family of a carrier or someone affected, the likelihood that they themselves will be a carrier will be greatly increased. So the genetic counsellor that works with our participants needs to know that. So next, obviously, all screening of participants will be told what you've been told about the fact that if you're a carrier, there are options should you be part of a carrier couple. And we run through that briefly, not in too much detail. Usually it's when we're screening couples through the clinic where the participants are going to be more interested in this. When we screen students in school, they're not worried so much about that. We just make sure that they're informed about the fact that if they are a couple, if they are a carrier down the line, they need to make sure that their partner is tested in the future if they plan on having children with them. And then I guess all that makes sure that the participant can give informed consent, after which they can then just provide their saliva sample. So we do all our testing using saliva rather than blood, which is just as an effective way of doing genetic testing. It just makes it way easier for us to deliver screenings because no blood involved and it doesn't get messy. So once they've provided their saliva sample, then they simply it simply gets sent to the lab, and we partner with a lab based in America, so we send it on to them. The lab will then send the results back to our genetic counsellor based at Norfolk Park Hospital, and they will then report the results to the screening participants. So for the Genius program, the turnaround time for results is 16 weeks. For the clinic, it's around 8 to 10 weeks. If we are screening someone who's pregnant, we can fast track the results as well. Although really we try and encourage as far as possible people to screen preconception, because it gives couples the greatest number of options should they be identified as a carrier couple. And I guess that's the benefit of us screening year 12 and university students. We're arming people with the knowledge of their status even before they go on to probably find their life partner. So preconception screening is really what we support, but we don't turn people away who are pregnant unless they're too far in their pregnancy to be able to do anything about it if they were to be in a scenario where they could be pregnant with an affected child. So I will, after that, I'll hand over to Nicole just for the last few slides. Nicole, you're muted.
Apologies, unmuted. Thanks, Aviva. Interesting as always. So, I mean, as I said earlier on, we've screened over 4,000 young adults to date, which is pretty significant. And actually, we're really sort of upping the numbers, and we're hoping to screen about 1,000 per year moving forward. We can only do this because of the endorsement we have from the wider community. We have tremendous stakeholder support. When we screen in universities, we have JSOC, we have the chaplaincy, we have reps on campus. I mean, we really have tremendous support. And obviously, you know, we do a lot of outreach, we do a lot of training and information, you know, seminars for rabbis and community leaders, which is sort of really of paramount importance to us delivering our message to the community. Obviously, we do training for healthcare professionals. We have been running in the last year, and you may actually have seen some, we've been working really hard at targeted fundraising events, and we try and bring in our funding by keeping things as wide and varied and appealing to different sectors of the community. Some of the things we've done in the last year which have been fun, we did Gin and Tonic, which was a virtual gin and tonic tasting event, which actually I think it was just amidst one of the lockdowns, everyone was so desperate we could hardly control the numbers that were signing up, so that was fantastic. We ran our first challenge event, which was a 180-mile cycle across the Lake District in the pouring rain. Obviously, it wasn't meant to be the pouring rain, but it was. But that raised us significant funds. one thing we did, which wasn't fundraising, it was really sort of awareness building, was last January we hijacked it and we turned it into January, and we did a massive sort of PR and outreach campaign. And it really, I mean, as Aviva said, it's not just the Jewish community that have those genetic disorders. There's other communities as well, and they were really interested in January. And I'm actually speaking at a conference next week called Breaking Down Barriers, and they wanted me to talk about January, and it might actually be picked up by other communities, which would be great. And we try and work really hard with the Jewish press, PR and advertising, and our social media channels are pretty active, and in trying to get to the individuals that we want to come forward and be screened. So I mean, all the good work we are doing is because we have so much support from the wider community. In terms of our partners, I mentioned earlier on that we are very unique in that we work very closely with the NHS, and we have full endorsement by them. You can see here, I won't go through them all, but we work with all the different synagogue movements. Fulgent is our lab in California. We work with chaplaincy. We work with UGS. So we have, and we're always adding to this this group. And because we're going to begin to screen for conditions that are prevalent within the Sephardi community, we'll be doing a big sort of outreach campaign to the Sephardi community as well. So how can you support us? We actually, they've come up very, very quickly, but never mind. never mind. So when we run these big screening events, and I think the one I talked about earlier was at the university last November, where Aviva, how many appointments? We had 300 kids over a week. We obviously can't do it with just our small genetic counselling team. So we have a massive pool of volunteers. Many of them have medical scientific backgrounds, and they come forward and they're actually trained by us to actually run some of these screenings for us. Obviously, if there's a complicated situation or there's a young adult with a family history, then it's a genetic counsellor. But we have, on our database, we have hundreds of volunteers. So if anybody would like to volunteer for us, please come forward. We have just launched our first young professional committee. I think we have the first meeting next week. So if there's anyone out there who would like to join and help us, I mean, these really are our target market. So they're coming together, and they're going to begin to put on events for us, which is fabulous. So I'm really excited to watch that one develop. Fundraising, I talked about. We do challenges. We're involved in the community fund run. We've done loads of Zoom events. We do what we can to try and fundraise. And I mean, just I need to bring in this year about £700,000 to deliver the screening programme effectively for the next 12 months. So that's a great deal of money for a really small charity. So in COVID times, it's been tough. Oh, is that the last slide? Yes. Okay. So. I mean, thank you. I mean, the one thing that I didn't see from the slide before is we really, really rely on word of mouth. If you have been screened, if you've listened to this presentation and you realise how important it is for young adults to come forward, we are desperately trying to shift the mindset of the community, and as Aviva says, to normalise screening. So please spread the word. Please tell your friends and your family. If you've got kids at school, then make sure they go through the screening process. It really is about knowledge is power, and knowing that you are a carrier for a certain condition can only hold you in good stead for the future. So thank you, and fire away any questions. Aviva, I think you're muted.
I'm going to unmute and be the first question, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know if it's a question. Maybe you can talk me through this. So PGD, the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, was that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Raises some tricky questions, some ethical questions. So, for example, which ones to replace if one's a carrier but not affected, and so on. I'm just wondering if the organisation signposts to some kind of counselling to help a couple navigate those questions.
So specifically, when we're screening in schools and universities, we're screening individuals. So we're not dealing with couples that are going to be imminently planning their family. But when we screen through the clinic, that's when we could identify a couple who are together, they're about to start their family, and they've suddenly found out that they're carriers. So as Nicole has said, we partner with the NHS to deliver our screening, and it's actually an NHS genetic counsellor that provides the genetic counselling before the test, but also after the test. So the most important scenario and the most important people that will need that genetic counselling within the NHS are those carrier couples. So that they'll be guided through hopefully a smooth but can be a rocky and difficult journey with a NHS genetic counsellor, through learning about what the options are for them, deciding which is most suitable for them, and then guiding them through the process until hopefully they have their healthy baby. So because we partner with the NHS, as soon as a carrier couple is identified, they're automatically streamlined into the system, where obviously day in, day out, there's genetic counsellors supporting carrier couples through that kind of journey.
And Shoshana, it's probably worth us saying as well that very often a lot of the time we don't know who the carrier couples are. Once the sample goes off to the lab, I can't say our job ends there, but we will never receive the information back. We receive statistics, so we might be told, I don't know, X% of people who had screened had Tay-Sachs, or X% had, but we will never ever be given individual results. So the carrier couples that you saw in the film, they actually came forward to us and said, we've had, thanks to genetics, we've got lovely healthy children, and we want to spread the word, and how can we help you? So that's why, as Aviva says, it's really sort of all down to the NHS at that point, because we don't really know who these people are.
That's a great preservation of anonymity, but also I hadn't realised that the NHS immediately steps in to provide all of the wraparound counselling and genetic support there.
And also, and a question that we're also asked is, how is it seen, halakhically? And the answer to that question is each situation is treated as an individual, and I believe that it's up to sort of the individual rabbis or community leaders to sort of counsel the couples. So that's I don't think there's any rights or wrongs. I think each situation is just treated as a separate entity. So
absolutely, and in our first series we had a session on vaccinations, and we looked at the truths and myths of vaccinations, is what we called it, and we touched on some of the halachic, the Jewish legalistic questions around it. And I'd suggest that much of that can be just decanted into the same topic of carrier screening for genetic diseases, because there's consensus within the Jewish community, definitely within the UK, and definitely within the US and Israel. So I think consensus across the board of the Jewish communities that genetic screening should be encouraged. And the premise is that we're tasked to safeguard our lives, to safeguard our health, and by extension also the health of our children and of our communities. And that's really what JNETICS does, is safeguards the health of our communities, individuals and communities. Science and medicine has been, put at our disposal and has allowed us to mitigate any of these diseases, and given us really the opportunity to get rid of them altogether. And it would be I use the word very at risk, but it would be a sin not to use the science and medicine at our disposal in order to eradicate diseases that destroy and undermine the general health of our communities. So I would say that the halachic premises that we looked at when we spoke about vaccinations can really just be transposed onto this issue as well.
And I think when you look at the Haredi community, they've done an amazing job. The Haredi community are tested through another organisation called Dor Yeshurin, and that's anonymous, so they never ever find their individual results, but when they're matched up, they're not ever matched up with someone else who has the same, genetic disorder. And they've actually, I'm not allowed to use the word eradicate, am I, Viva? I'll get smacked for that. But they have pretty much, eradicated these Jewish genetic disorders from their community. So actually, I think they've done an absolutely amazing job. We just have to make sure within the more sort of, mainstream Jewish community that we're to carry a condition. I'm a Tay-Sachs carrier. It's never affected my health. It's never going to affect my health. It's really only when you have a carrier couple that, things are serious, I guess. But in the world we're living today, then, we can do things. We can signpost, we can help couples and make sure that nobody has to go through the heartache of having a baby with one of these, terrible genetic disorders. And in fact, the first gentleman and his wife you saw in the film is actually the chairman of the charity, and they lost a 28-year-old son to cystic fibrosis, and he's extremely passionate and made a promise to his son that when babies are born with these conditions, there's no cures. I mean, at the moment, there's no cures. So he made a promise that he would do everything in his power to try and prevent babies being born into the community. And that's why, he's chairman. There's always a story, but that's his story. So.
And just finally, can I ask one more question? And that is, what would you say to someone like myself who's of Sephardi heritage? What would be the value in being tested if I am, so I'm married to someone of absolutely pure blood Ashkenazi heritage. So how does...
So with our current test sorry, go on, Nicole, do you want to? No,
you can answer. I was going to say that actually, because the panel is mixed. Aviva, correct me if I'm wrong. She's the very clever one. Because the panel is going to be a mixture of Ashkenazi and Sephardi, then any conditions. Do you want to answer it, Aviva? Actually, I don't want to get it wrong.
No, I mean, at the moment, we focus on 9 Ashkenazi conditions. So it is a Ashkenazi test, and if there would be a mixed couple, like you, we would suggest the Ashkenazi partner getting tested first, and only after the results would come back, if there would be a carrier identified, then the other partner get tested. But come September, that's going to be irrelevant, because we're going to be expanding the panel,
mixed panel,
to include Ashkenazi and Sephardi conditions as well, which helps couples in your scenario who have mixed ethnicity, helps people who have both Sephardi and Ashkenazi ethnicity at the same time, and also people who might be purely Sephardi who have never been able to help in the same way as before. So if like a couple like you would come to us now and say we want to get screened, we'd probably just say, well, our test at the moment's not as relevant to you as it could be. Wait until September. We have this new panel which will be able to be a lot more clinically useful.
And Shoshana, couple of the conditions, because I've seen the new panel, it's quite incredible how high the carrier frequency is in the Sephardi community. I mean, there was one Aviva which was really high. I don't know if it was 1 in 13 or something. So it's really, really important that you spread the word, and anyone who has a Sephardi origin, that they do come forward and they do get tested. So that's a really sort of exciting development for us.
Thanks. It's so funny to use the word exciting about these developments, but it genuinely is. And I think that I'm just gonna be honest, going for vaccinations, for my COVID vaccination, I just had my second one. It really is exciting. We're excited to be able to, and I don't know why we're not allowed to use the word eradicate. I don't know if you're just not allowed to, or if I'm not. It's exciting.
I'll tell you why we're not allowed. It's quite an interesting debate, Shoshana, but we can eradicate, because at the end of the day, it's individual choice. So if a test came back to say that you were a carrier and your husband was a carrier, you might actually take a decision, not to do anything and just go ahead with the pregnancy. So that's not our decision. So it's not within our power to eradicate. And that's apparently why we're not allowed to use the word erase or eradicate.
I see, it's a technicality. It's fine.
But you can use it, that's fine.
It's exciting. It is exciting. I'm going to stop the live stream on that note, but I want to thank you both, Nicole and Aviva, very, very much for your time this evening. We greatly, greatly appreciate you joining us.